Hello everyone, and a warm welcome to this 19th annual lecture from the History Council of Victoria. My name is Peter McPhee. I'm the chair of the History Council. I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the many lands on which we're meeting today. The History Council recognises the long history and profound significance of the cultural heritage of traditional owners. I'm speaking to you from the lands of the Wurundjeri people. Our presenting team today will be speaking from the lands of the Wurundjeri, the Boonwurrung and the Wadawurrung people of the Kulin Nation. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and extend our respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander and First Nations peoples. Let me say something to begin with about the History Council. This is the peak body for history in the state of Victoria. Our vision is to connect Victorians with history and to inspire engagement with the past, with our identities and with the world today. We champion the work of historians and the value of history about any place and about any period. The History Council was formed in 2001. Its board comprises representatives from cultural and educational institutions and heritage bodies. History teachers and curriculum advisors, academic and professional historians, and local Indigenous, community and specialist history organisations. Among our roles are advocacy and representation to government and the wider community, networking with allied history groups and community education, especially our Making Public Histories program. You can see some of the tabs to recent sessions of that program, which we deliver with our partners at the Old Treasury Building and the History program at Monash University. Through our Book and Author program, again you can see some tabs from that, and from the VCE Roadshow, which is supported by the Department of Education. A few housekeeping matters which will be familiar with to most of you. This is a meeting at which only the presenters and hosts will be seen and heard, unlike a Zoom meeting. After the lecture, there will be about 20 minutes of Q&A, and you'll be able to use the Q&A bottom of the screen during that session. If you have technical issues or simply want to express your opinions during the lecture, you can certainly use the chat room. If in terms of technical issues, if there is a problem with the presenter's internet connection, they'll continue just with their video closed. We're recording this lecture tonight, and the recording will be available next week. We know it'll be extraordinarily successful. And of course, finally, do keep your questions polite and respectful. Before I introduce this evening's lecturer, I want to announce this year's recipient of the Jane Hanson Prize for History Advocacy. This is a prize which was established in 2020 to recognise the efforts of a group or an individual that has advocated the value of history, for the work of historians, and/or the importance of an education in history. The prize is named in honour of Jane Hanson, whose passion for history and its advocacy is widely acknowledged. I should note also that when we call for nominations for next year's Hanson Prize, we'll also be calling for nominations for the Lynette Russell Prize to recognise the efforts of a group of Victorian school students in years P to 10 in their studies of First Peoples history. But I'm now going to introduce Professor David Lowe, the Deputy Chair of the History Council, to present this year's award. Over to you, David.
Thanks very much, Peter. And I'm delighted to make two announcements. The first is a high commendation by the judges of the award. The judges highly commended Susan Jennison for her outstanding range of work at a local level. This has included saving buildings, restorations, history advocacy, tours, events, publications and leadership of Keilor Historical Society. So congratulations to Susan for that commendation. And now I'd like to announce on behalf of the the History Council of Victoria and the Jane Hansen Prize that the 2022 winner of the Jane Hansen Prize for History Advocacy is Gideon Haigh. Gideon is a worthy recipient for several reasons. First, this is because of his extraordinary achievement in leading the successful campaign to secure additional funding for urgent preservation of film and audio material at the National Archives of Australia. Safeguarding our nation's history continues to be a critical issue. Gideon's cumulative contribution led to the success of ensuring the preservation of collections of national significance. We feel Gideon went over and above his role as a journalist and writer and has had extraordinary national impact. We also acknowledge the exceptional range of his own recent publications of significance and his eminence as a historical researcher and writer. And we here at the History Council of Victoria were very fortunate to have him join us for a book and author event in which he discussed both recent advocacy work and a recent publication, A Brilliant Boy, his portrait of Dr. Evatt in particular. In rallying colleagues and saving generations of historical records, Gideon has most definitely advocated for the value of history and the work of historians. So Gideon, delighted to congratulate you on the winner of the 2022 Jane Hansen Prize.
David, I'm delighted to be congratulated. Thank you very much for this unexpected honour for a very unlikely campaign. I should like to say that I owe much of this to Amanda Stoker. At Senate estimates last year, she displayed such blithe indifference to the importance of historical records that I felt honour bound to put her through the ringer in the op-ed pages of the Australian. That got me talking to that great man Graham Davison, to Claire Wright, to Michelle Arrow, to other like-minded souls about what we could do to turn the tide. I'm not a historian by trade. I'm just a jobbing journo who's always been easily beguiled by the past. But you know, if you don't ask, you don't get. I also suspect that in lockdown last year, I was spoiling for a fight. So thanks to Dan Andrews as well. If you've got an interest in what's gone before, there could hardly be a cause more uniting and galvanizing than the preservation of primary documents. They're the staff of life to researchers. But we sometimes forget that records don't merely come cascading from posterity, that they require, you know, systematic and far-sighted decisions to collect, to catalogue, to preserve, to protect. And they're big decisions because they're selfless. There's no immediate payoff to them. You don't get a tribute for doing so. There's not a buck or a vote to be had. Had I been appalled by the decline of National Archives of Australia? Yes, of course I had. But had I been surprised? No, not even slightly. We've got to have these arguments. They've got to be started. They have to be won. And if not by us, then who? This is also, I think, something to join hands on. You know, we live in these very partisan times in which we probably spend most of the time talking amongst ourselves. I felt strongly, and Graham agreed with me, that any campaign we mounted had to do more than just rally the faithful. We had to kind of slide through back channels. We had to kind of reach across the aisle because the other side of the aisle was where the money lay. And we should have some fun. And I think we did have some fun. I think I enjoyed it, and I think Graham did too. We've got another battle ahead of us now, the state of our collecting institutions. It's urgent for coming so late. At the time that he gave us the emergency funding, I said to Josh Frydenberg, "You've done the right thing, but don't expect me to thank you for it. This is the outcome of decades of false economy. You're just having to put back in multiples what you took out." And that, I think, is trebly so where National Library, the National Museum, National Gallery, National Film and Sound Archive, and our other collecting institutions are concerned. They've been incapacitated over decades by the efficiency dividend, as well as the general, climate of Philistinism. Anyway, that's for another day. I'm raving on a bit. It suffices to express my gratitude to the History Council of Victoria and also to Jane Hansen, who's endowed this award. while also knowing that the advocacy of history is a little bit like, painting the harbour bridge. You've no sooner finished at one end than you need to go back and start again at the other. So thanks very much and good evening.
Thanks very much, Gideon. We're all grateful beneficiaries of that advocacy, and you're quite right to remind us of just how much ongoing work there is ahead and the parlous state of our cultural institutions. But in addition to advocacy, there's also got to be a degree of skill, and you've certainly demonstrated that in your campaigns in recent times. So thanks again, and congratulations. And I'll now hand everyone back to Peter.
Oh, thanks, David, and thanks, Gideon, for those wise words. Many of the people listening, of course, will appreciate Gideon's work as a practicing historian, despite his modesty, and his clothes make us well aware that he's also a practicing cricketer and a brilliant cricketing journalist. But we're absolutely delighted that you've received the award, Gideon. So let me now turn to introducing our special lecturer. Catherine Kervishy is the head of the discipline of history at the University of Melbourne. She's a graduate of the University of Western Australia and of the University of Oxford, where she completed her DPhil in history. Catherine's main research areas are the discourses surrounding luxury consumption in early modern Italy and Florentine and Venetian social and cultural history. She's published an important book on sumptuary law in Italy from 1200 to 1500. She's also published on the history of women religious in Australia. She authored a superb book, Pitch Your Tents on Distant Shores, a history of the Sisters of the Good Shepherd in Australia, Aotearoa, New Zealand, and Tahiti. And in that book, the Abbotsford Convent that so many of you will be familiar with features large. She's also the co-general editor of the forthcoming 6-volume Bloomsbury series, A Cultural History of Luxury. Catherine has a deep knowledge of the history of the city of Venice, taking students there biennially since 2007 and curating cultural visits to the city. In 2019, she curated a series of cultural events and activities for Australian donors to the Venice Biennale on behalf of the Australian Council for the Arts and for the University of Melbourne. Her lecture this evening is Beauty in Response to Plague, the City of Venice. And I invite Catherine to present our annual lecture. Over to you, Catherine.
Thank you very much, Peter, for that generous introduction, and to Professor David Lowe and Alicia Cereto and the History Council of Victoria for the honour and privilege of delivering this year's lecture. In doing so, I acknowledge the Bunurong Boonwurrung and the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung peoples of the Eastern Kulin Nation, on whose lands I'm speaking this evening. Lands which were never ceded, and on which for millennia their knowledges were and are maintained and shared through oral tradition and the telling of stories. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And now I'll share my screen. Because this evening, I want to take you from the island of Australia to another island world and tell some of its stories in the hope that they may have some resonance with you all in our current pandemic twilight zone, and that they may offer points of reference, but also points of difference in the ways in which people can respond to the trauma of plague and its ongoing invisible threat. I am, of course, talking about the islands that make up the shimmering city of Venice. For over 20 years, I've been lecturing to my first-year students at Melbourne about the Great Plague known as the Black Death, that first arrived in Italy in late 1347 and thence to the rest of Europe. Almost every year, like a depressing chime on a clock, another plague has broken out somewhere in the world, enabling me to draw comparisons for my students: the AIDS virus, anthrax attacks, Ebola, SARS. But in no time in my teaching career has this subject had such immediate resonance as it did in first semester 2020 and on into this year, as my students and I watched the unfolding first of dreadful rumours and then of the spread of the virus indelibly known to us all as COVID-19. The parallels with the primary sources they were reading about the deleterious effects on society and its very structures, about the rumour mongering, the desperate search for causes and hence cures, the blaming and attack on certain ethnic groups, these never seemed more pertinent, bringing to mind Voltaire's statement that history may not repeat itself, but man always does. The origin of this great plague, as with COVID-19, is much disputed, including whether or not it was indeed Yersinia pestis or bubonic plague. Every year there is new and fascinating research and data about these origin stories and the possible nature of the plague itself, and I could in fact give a lecture solely on that topic. The traditional origin narrative, and the one most often repeated, is derived from an Italian notary, Gabriele de' Mussi, who never left his native Piacenza in the north of Italy, but who wrote the first book solely dedicated to plague, at least in the Western canon, Historia de Morbis, as though he had travelled further afield. According to de' Mussi, its origin was in Caffa, modern-day Feodosia in the Crimea, where the city, then a Genoese merchant colony, was under prolonged siege for the second time by the forces of the Mongol Khan Yanibeg in 1347. Yanibeg's soldiers had become ill with a terrible disease raging in Western Eurasia, and according to de' Mussi, Yanibeg perpetrated one of the first known cases of biological warfare, catapulting bodies of the infected dead over the city walls. By the time a Genoese ship docked at Messina in the south of Italy in October 1347, everyone on board was desperately ill. Alternative hypotheses place its route to Europe further north in the Black Sea, in the port city of Tana on the Sea of Azov, where Venetian merchants revived the defunct port as a trading colony from at least 1326, not only for grain, but also, critically, for the hemp needed for the ropes of their ships. This relationship is still present in the name of an area of Venice, the fondamenta or bank, the rio or canal, the ponte, bridge, and campo, square, della Tana, which you can see there at the bottom of the slide, and I've just circled it for you on an old map and its present map there. The Rio della Tana is adjacent to the lengthiest building in Venice, the corderia, or rope-making building for which the hemp was needed, now one of the sites of the Venice Art Biennale. And I want you to remember the size and structure of this building, because I'll come back to it later. In all accounts, however, it is the Western Eurasian steppes occupied by the Mongol Khans that seem to have been the crucial transmission sites via the port cities of the Black Sea and the Italian merchants who plied them, which brought the plague to Europe. And you can see it here. There are the two ports there and there, and you can see the ways in which it went. People talk about the plague girdle because it kind of girdled the whole of Europe and coming back almost to its starting point. The grey area that you see here is not because plague didn't get there, but there isn't data for that period to enable people to track its course. Indeed, de' Mussi, though blaming the Genoese as prime movers, includes the Venetians as at least complicit. As he wrote, "Confess, O Genoa, what thou hast done, since we of Genoa and Venice are compelled to make God's chastisement manifest. Alas, our ships enter the port, but of 1,000 sailors, hardly 10 are spared. We reach our homes, our kindred and our neighbours come from all parts to visit us. Woe to us, for we cast at them the darts of death. Whilst we spoke to them, whilst they embraced us and kissed us, we scattered the poison from our lips. Going back to their homes, they in turn soon infected their whole families, who in 3 days succumbed and were buried in one common grave. Priests and doctors visiting the sick returned from their duties ill and soon were numbered with the dead. O death, cruel, bitter, impious death, which thus breaks the bonds of affection and divides father and mother, brother and sister, son and wife. Lamenting our misery, we feared to fly, yet we dared not remain. In a strange and disturbing coincidence, it was again Demosi's hometown of Piacenza that was the closest city to the first COVID-19 outbreak in Italy in February 2020, and which had the highest national death rates per head of population. Whether or not it was Janibeg and the Genoese and or the Venetians and the trade in grain and hemp, whether or not it was bubonic plague or an as yet unidentified bacterium or virus, for the purposes of this evening's lecture, I want you to hold on to the emotion present in Demosi's account, to hold on to the idea of the fear that this unknown disease created, a morbid fear that did not leave Europe for the next 4 centuries. In its first wave that lasted about 4 years, it's been credibly estimated that 25 million people in Europe lost their lives, and that many millions more lost them in North Africa and Eurasia. Though no subsequent outbreak was as catastrophic as this first wave, it was followed by the so-called children's plague, wiping out the young as well as the elderly, by famine caused by lack of workers to till the soil, by price gouging, lack of skilled and unskilled workers, wage issues, civil unrest, and the fear that this unknown disease could return, and invariably did. The last recorded outbreak of this plague was in Marseilles in 1721. And no European city managed successfully to regain its pre-plague population levels until the mid-18th century. Throughout the centuries of this plague, it was inevitably port cities that were most vulnerable and which had to be most vigilant. What I'd like to do this evening is outline the responses of Venice, a supreme trading port that was to become the wealthiest city in Europe. Its responses both to the threat of plague and methods for its prevention in practical terms, and then to the ways in which the city and its inhabitants tried to prevent plague and give thanks for relief from plague in quite spectacular architectural, artistic, and a ritually laden fashion. The city and its architectural and artistic landscape, so familiar to us all, whether or not we've ever been there, is in fact one of the most beautiful responses to the constant presence of plague. As its first line of defence, the Republic of Venice instituted a detailed quarantine system for people and for goods arriving in the lagoon. As far as we know, the first government in Europe to institute quarantine was that of the Venetian territory of Ragusa, modern-day Dubrovnik, and the red and orangey sections there show Venetian overseas territories on this map. On the 27th of July, 1377, the rector of the city issued a 30-day isolation period for ships and then a 40-day isolation period for those coming by land. The name quarantine, or quarantena in Italian, derives from the number 40, quaranta. In practice, isolation periods varied from region to region, but the notion of 40 days remained, almost as a sacred numerical designation, in imitation of the period spent by Jesus in the desert, which in turn inspired the period of Lent in the Christian calendar. By the early 15th century, the Venetian government had itself instituted quarantine, overseen by a special magistracy, the Magistrato della Sanità, or the health magistracy, and its provveditori, or officers. The Provveditori di Sanità had oversight of all health perils to the Republic and its territories, whether merchandise, animals, people, boats, all were subjected to rigorous inspections, and some areas could readily be declared no-go zones. Being centred in a lagoon with numerous small and larger islands to hand, the Venetians were well provisioned for establishing quarantine. 3 islands were used over the centuries by the Venetians. And here you see in red the Lazzaretto Vecchio, up there the Lazzaretto Nuovo, and I've just highlighted here a 3rd island, which was also used for quarantine from 1776, the island of Poveglia, but I won't be discussing Poveglia tonight because it's outside my time period for this evening's lecture, but also it's known as the most haunted place on earth, and it's forbidden to go there, which doesn't stop young Venetian hoons getting there on their motorboats, but you're not technically supposed to go to that island. Our English word of lazzaretto or lazaretto as a place for people with infectious diseases to quarantine is in fact derived from these Venetian islands. The oldest, the Lazzaretto Vecchio, was established in 1423 on an island originally used as a monastery called Our Lady of Nazareth, Santa Maria di Nazzaretto, whose church was built there in 1249. From this full title came a shortening to La Nazzaretto and then Lazzaretto, which was then elided into Lazzaretto. The island is 2.5 hectares in size, 8,500 square meters of which was devoted to buildings for the sick. Unfortunately, in the 19th century, it was given over for use as military storage, and many of the original buildings were demolished, often by exploding munitions, including the ancient church and its Romanesque bell tower. But we can get an idea of its appearance from a painting by Giacomo Guardi. These aerial views of it give you an idea of its location in relation to the main area of Venice. Some core buildings, however, do still survive. Here we see the main administrative buildings and storage buildings. And if you look this area over here, that building was given over to the prior and his family who had jurisdiction over the island. Not a great gig, I wouldn't imagine, but that's where they lived. And the sick were at first housed in a building called the Tezzone or Tezzon in Venetian. The main entry to this repays some analysis. Depicted here is the winged lion, symbol of St. Mark the Evangelist of the Gospel and patron saint of the city of Venice. Mark is also represented in human form in the center. He is flanked by 2 key plague saints, Saint Sebastian, San Sebastiano in Italian, and Saint Roch or San Rocco. Saint Sebastian was a 4th century Roman commander of archers whose conversion to Christianity led to a sentence of execution by arrows from his own men. Left for dead, according to the hagiography in any case, he was rescued by a kindly woman, but when his survival was made known, he was then bludgeoned to death. He is, however, most commonly depicted not being bludgeoned, but almost naked as here, bristling with arrows. This is a representation of him by Mantegna. He was called upon for intercession with God against plague because so often people describe the sudden attack of plague symptoms as coming through the air out of nowhere like arrows. San Rocco, on the other hand, is almost contemporaneous. A pilgrim from Marseilles to Italy, when a plague broke out, he nursed the sick until he too became infected and retired to a forest so as not to infect others. Kept alive by his loyal dog who brought him food to eat, on returning to his homeland, he was not recognized and was initially imprisoned. San Rocco is nearly always depicted with a pilgrim's hat and staff, as here in this image by Crivelli, usually kindly pulling up his leggings for you to show you a bubo in his groin, with or without his loyal dog. And I'll return to both these saints later. As the numbers of infected people increased, more accommodation was needed on the Lazzaretto. And so the Crozzola was built in 1525, its name derived from the cross shape of the building. The few who managed to recover from the plague were transferred to this building to convalesce. Excavations on the island in 2007 uncovered several plague pits, and so far more than 1,500 bodies have been recovered. Transfer to the Lazzaretto was a terrifying experience, with advice given by the Magistrato della Sanità to its employees as to the best time to come for people and to take them to the island, preferably at night, so that there would be minimal potential for crowds to gather and unrest to develop. As described by a notary of the city, Rocco Benedetti, the Lazzaretto Vecchio seemed like hell itself. From every side there came foul odours, and indeed a stench that none could endure. Groans and sighs were heard without ceasing, and at all hours clouds of smoke from the burning of corpses were seen to rise far into the air. Some who miraculously returned from that place alive reported, among other things, that at the height of that great influx of infected people, there were 3 and 4 of them to a bed. Workers collected the dead and threw them in the graves all day without a break. Often the dying ones and the ones too sick to move or talk were taken for dead and thrown on the piled corpses. Whilst the Lazzaretto Vecchio was designed to remove infected people from the city itself, A few decades later, the Venetians established a sophisticated isolation system to prevent infection, whether in people or in goods, from entering the city. For this, they selected another island, 3 kilometers northeast of the city, the newly designated Lazzaretto Nuovo in 1468. Originally another monastery island called Vigna Murada, or walled vineyard, this island is about 9 hectares in size. From the 11th century, it had become the property of the Benedictine monks of San Giorgio Maggiore, who built a church there dedicated to St. Bartholomew and a monastery complex with salt flats. When the Venetian government requisitioned the island, they turned it into a state-of-the-art quarantine facility with an eventual 3,500 square meters of buildings where boats arriving in the lagoon suspected of carrying illness, whether in goods or people, had to dock. After the Napoleonic invasion, because of its strategic location, it became a military outpost, and many of the original structures were demolished. And this is how you see it today from the air. Its original appearance has been reconstructed by Fazzini and Valletta. According to the 16th century Venetian historian Francesco Sansavino, in 1576 it had 100 rooms and lots of chimneys built in the wide Venetian style and looked from afar like a castle. And again, it's Giacomo Guardi who gives us some idea of how that looked. The Lazzaretto Nuovo is now a site of intense archaeological excavation, in particular by a group led by Dr. Ambika Flavel, who I hope is online tonight. Ambika is a Venetian-born, West Australian-based forensic anthropologist who has been excavating the cemeteries on the island, one of which was Christian and the other Muslim, and who brings students to help her from UWA to the island. I had the privilege of going to the island on a special visit this last July, where Ambika spoke movingly about what they're learning from the bodies they have uncovered. The most striking of the buildings which remains is the Tezzone Grande. At more than 100 meters in length, this is, after the Corderia, which we saw earlier, the second most extensive building in the lagoon. And suppositions have been put forward that it was the same builders who might have constructed it, using the inimitable shipbuilding techniques of Venetians in its construction. On the walls of the Tezzone are several examples of graffiti from the 16th century, which are also being analysed by graphologists and historians. Here in the Tezzone, merchandise could be laid out and treated with balsams and other odoriferous products such as rosemary and juniper to disinfect them and counter any miasma or foul-smelling airs with an equal and opposing sweet smell. Goods and people were divided into 3 categories: netti or clean, sporchi or infected, or sospetti, suspicious. Any person found to be contagious was immediately transferred to the island of the Lazzaretto Vecchio. One of the remaining cisterns on the island, a Vera da Pozzo in Venetian, has an interesting representation of the winged lion of St. Mark. Here it's a so-called leone in moeca, and moeca are soft-shelled crabs in Venice, and the leone in moeca, his wings are around him like a little crab. And normally his book is open in front of him. Here the book is closed, which is usually a sign of Venice at war. But here instead the lion is at peace, but indicating that your liberties are limited. The Magistrato della Sanità also issued health passes, fede di sanità, which people had to carry on their persons before moving within the city during times of plague and between cities. And here are some examples of them. Rocco Benedetti, the notary whom I quoted earlier, worked at the Rialto and noted that during plague, people had to stay in their houses for 15 days, sound familiar? And that there was a blockade in the middle of the Rialto Bridge, which in order to pass, you had to show your health pass. And here you can see on the one on the left, the main one here, I've just translated for you what it says there. The undersigned depart from this dominion healthy, God be praised, and free from every suspicion of contagion, with their goods or with merchandise or without. You fill the form in appropriately, as here undernoted, to whom in whichever place they arrive shall be given free and secure passage. Those who broke the health laws could be denounced by other citizens in conveniently placed bocche or mouths, and if the denunciation was discovered, to be well-founded, denouncers received a portion of the fine to encourage them to do so. But Venetians did not just rely on physical impediments and possible cures to plague. Theirs was an all-encompassing worldview of the Christian salvific story, in which they were active players in the unfolding, divinely directed drama of life, death, and the afterlife. Spiritual defence was therefore an even higher prerogative. Whilst this could occur, obviously, in the privacy of one's home, in personal prayer and supplication, or within the walls of monasteries and convents in the regular recitation of the divine office, Venetians also created public spaces within their city in which their prayers and beliefs were literally embodied in stone and in art, places which became the locus for extraordinary ritual anti-plague practice. There are 5 plague votive churches in Venice and at least one place of popular anti-plague devotion, and it's to these that I will now turn. And here I'd like to thank Jennifer McFarland, herself a superb emerging historian of Venice, for creating this beautiful map for me. In taking you through these places, which were sites of ongoing building and renovation, it was hard for me to decide the order. Should it be in order of when the plague occurred, when the buildings were consecrated? And in the end, I decided to take the date of consecration for the order in which I'll discuss them. The first of these is that of San Giobbe, San Giobbo in Venetian, or Job in English. The Venetians followed the Eastern Rite in nominating significant Old Testament figures as saints, hence Saint Job. Job was, of course, famously and endlessly afflicted with suffering by God and endured all. So he, together with Rocco and Sebastiano, is an appropriate saint to venerate in times of plague. Initially, a small hospice and oratory was dedicated to San Giobbe and funded by Giovanni Contarini. Then a confraternity, a lay brotherhood of San Giobbe, was established at this site in 1378 after an outbreak of plague. This was in a humble part of the city, not terribly wealthy. Gradually, the site expanded, and in 1450, a church in the Gothic style was begun by Antonio Gambello. In 1470, however, the current Doge, Cristoforo Moro, intervened in an ambitious program of expansion. He also chose to be buried there. And the future great architect and stonemason Pietro Lombardo was asked to complete the work. This was to be his first architectural commission in Venice and one of the first clear examples of Renaissance architecture in the city, praised amongst others by John Ruskin. The church was rededicated in 1493 and given a dual dedication to St. Job and to San Bernardino of Siena. It looks a little bit worse for wear at the moment because it was suppressed by Napoleon in 1810 and the adjacent convent destroyed. I'm also a bit mystified as to what has happened to the 3 statues which you see on the portal in this old picture, but which have disappeared from the current portal. Anyway, for another lecture or another time. While most are now unaware of this church, historians and lovers of art might be more familiar with its famous altarpiece. Here we have again the church and its interior. And here's this altarpiece, painted by Giovanni Bellini for the church after another outbreak of plague in 1485, although scholars continued to contest its precise dating. Looted by Napoleon, but later restored to the Venetians, the painting is now in the Galleria dell'Accademia in Venice, with a photographic reproduction in situ in the church, which you can see in the right there. In looking at this painting, possibly the earliest by Bellini to use oil, we should note the prominence of plague saints involved in a holy conversation, Sacra Conversazione, with the Virgin Mary, St. Job on the left and St. Sebastian on the right. Whilst San Giobbe was in a relative periphery of the city, a much more ambitious program was gradually undertaken in the Sestiere or district of San Polo, and this focused on the plague saint San Rocco. A confraternity dedicated to San Rocco was founded in the city in the plague year of 1478. Originally meeting in a church near St. Mark's Square, the confraternity was then given a small building behind the Franciscan compound of Santa Maria Gloriosa dei Frari in San Polo. But in 1485, the confraternity's status increased as it acquired the relics of the body of the great saint himself, which were translated from the town of Volgera to Venice. Such a great relic needed a suitably impressive resting place. And so a church was built by Pietro Bon adjacent to their meeting place. So the original meeting place was in this building here, and that's the back of the Frari church just there. The church was extensively rebuilt by Giovanni Scalfarotto in 1725 and a facade erected in 1765 to 71 by Giorgio Fossati and Bernardina Maccaruzzi, and you can now see how extraordinary it is. As the cult of San Rocco increased, a larger building was needed for the confraternal buildings and a substantial building or scuola. And actually, if I just go back to this, you can see the substantial building here, which faces the original building there, was erected opposite that small building and is now most well known for the massive and extensive series of paintings by Jacopo Robusti, known as Tintoretto, who won the commission of decorating its walls and ceilings, together with further paintings in the church itself, a commission which occupied him for 30 years. So here you see this is inside the church, and here's the statue of St. Roch, again showing a bit of his thigh and his bubo very helpfully for us. Standing atop here, this is the box which contains the body, which you can see again here. And on his feast day, the front of that is lowered down and you can see the skeleton inside. Here we have Tintoretto's apotheosis of San Rocco, which is on the ceiling in the main meeting room or albergo of the scuola, and here another of his many examples there. But the church and scuola of San Rocco soon became the largest anti-plague compound of the city, and it repays many visits. It's an extraordinary place. After a further outbreak of plague in 1575-6 had finally eased, the Doge and his governing signoria visited San Rocco on the saint's feast day of 16th of August to give thanks for his intercession on behalf of the city. And San Rocco was formally declared a joint patron saint of the city. This tradition of visitation to San Rocco on his feast day to give protection to the city continues to this day. But if you remember, San Rocco's companion in the spiritual fight against plague is San Sebastiano, and in the Sestiere of Dorsoduro, a site was also dedicated to this saint. As with the church of San Giove, San Sebastiano was built on the site of an original hospice established in 1393 and an oratory of 1396. But it was in 1468 that the oratory was expanded and dedicated to Saint Sebastian. In 1506, restructuring work was begun by Antonio Abboni, known as Scarpagnino, and in the middle of the 16th century, the great work of decorating its walls and ceilings was given to Paolo Cagliari, known as Veronese, with the final church consecrated in 1562. Just as San Rocco is a secular temple to Tintoretto, so San Sebastiano is a secular temple to Veronese, and ongoing and extraordinary restoration work is being carried out by Save Venice. And the image on the left there, it gives you, because all the pews have been removed, this and it's the big cleanup after the terrible high water of 2019. But it's a great example to show you the sort of space and the walls and ceiling covered with images by Veronese. And here you see the clubbing of St. Sebastian to death, and then his apotheosis on the right-hand side there. Just 12 years after the consecration of San Sebastiano, however, one of the most ferocious outbreaks of plague hit the city of Venice in 1575-76. In this year, 50,000 Venetians died, almost 1/3 of the city's population of 170,000. As well as the usual practical measures, the Doge and the Senate, in a final effort at supplication, prayed to Christ, the Redeemer of mankind, the Redentore, and promised that if the plague should cease, then the city would erect a magnificent church in his honor. The plague did indeed cease, and a site for the promised church was selected on the island of the Giudecca. Begun by Palladio and completed after his death in 1580 by his foreman Antonio da Ponte, but keeping true to the original Palladian design, the Church of the Santissimo Redentore has a dome of 15.25 meters and a length of 69 meters. It's visible from afar as it is the first Palladian church to rise up from the pavement. Care of the church was entrusted to the Capuchin order of friars, who take austere vows of poverty and who insisted that in taking on its custodianship, the interior must be somber, So here there is no Tintoretto or Veronese pictorial extravaganza, but instead a beautiful emphasis on architectural design. As part of their promise to Christ, the Most Holy Redeemer, the Senate promised that each year on the Feast of the Redeemer, which falls on the third Sunday of July, the Doge and the Patriarch of the city would walk across to his church on the Giudecca on a pontoon bridge supported by boats to give thanks. Another tradition that continues to this day, in which the Patriarch at the end of the day celebrates Mass and then exits the church to bless the entire city and its lagoon. The Feast of the Redentore has become one of the most glorious festivals in the world. On the Saturday before the feast, Venetians crowd onto every terrace in the city or decorate their boats, large and small, and head out into the basin of the lagoon to prepare for the most spectacular of firework shows, which starts at 11:20 p.m. and lasts for a full 40 minutes. And I've just got a little bit, I won't play it all for you, but just to give you a little idea of what it's like. And it keeps going. And still it keeps going. Fast forward here right to the denouement. And if you're sitting on a little boat in the water while that is happening around you is really one of the most breathtaking experiences, and I would recommend it to any of you, despite the terrible heat of Venice in July. But despite building this church, plague returned to the city again, this time arriving in 1629, lasting for 16 months in the city, during which 46,490 Venetians died out of a total population of 140,000. And so another church was called for. On the 22nd of October, 1630, the Senate commissioned a new church to be built, this time dedicated to Our Lady of Good Health / Salvation, Santa Maria della Salute, the word has a double meaning, in the hope that the Virgin Mary, patroness of the city, would intercede with God to save them. In December 1630, a competition was held for the design. Of the 11 projects submitted, it was the design of Baldassare Longhena that was chosen. Though heavily influenced by Palladio and the Redentore, especially in having only the high altar visible on entering, Longhena's was a unique design for Venice, octagonal rather than cruciform in design, and was chosen as, quote, new and original, such as had never before been built in Venice. The octagon, with 6 chapels radiating out from its centre, surmounted by a double dome, atop which stands the Virgin Mary, was chosen to symbolize the shape of the Virgin of the Immaculate Conception's crown. As Longhena wrote, the mystery contained in the dedication of this church to the Blessed Virgin made me think, with what little talent God has bestowed on me, of building the church in the form of a rotunda, being in the shape of a crown, since it is dedicated to the Virgin. To support such an edifice, over 100,000 wooden pylons were laboriously hammered into the mud below. A sacred Byzantine icon of the Madonna della Salute, or Mesopanditissa, from the island of Crete, was gifted to the basilica by Francesco Morosini in 1670, when Venetians ceded the island to the Turks, and it is at the centre of its altar. The sculpted altarpiece surmounting it was designed by the Flemish sculptor Just Lecourt, and here you see the personification of Venice on the left, praying to the Virgin on her knees, whilst to the right, the personification of plague flees in terror. For me, one of the most beautiful aspects of this basilica is its floor, which contains at its core the reason for the basilica's creation and dedication. So roses, of course, are also a symbol of the Virgin Mary, and you can see those in the centre. And then right in the centre, written around the black marble in the centre there, are the words unde origo, inde salus, from whence our origin, hence our salvation / health. The feast day of the Salute is celebrated on the 21st of November, the feast of the presentation of the Virgin Mary in the temple. Though not as spectacular as the Redentore, in many ways this is possibly the most beloved of Venetian festivals by the locals, and Venetians return to the city from all around the district for this feast day. Again, a votive pontoon is built to cross the Grand Canal from the Sestiere of San Marco across to the Basilica. And on arrival in the Basilica, Venetians light a multitude of candles within to bring health upon their families for the following year. And it is, above all, a feast of candles and light, and also of balloons, which every Venetian child hankers for on this day. The significance of this feast and of this basilica was not lost as a political message when, as the severity of the outbreak of COVID-19 in Italy became clear, on the 13th of March 2020, the mayor of Venice, Luigi Brugnaro, publicly knelt before the Madonna della Salute in an act of rededication. But beyond these magnificent structures embedded in the world's imaginings of Venice lies another, humbler local response to plague. And it is with the Corte Nova in the Castello district that I wish to conclude tonight. Here, the residents also responded to the plague of 1630 and of 1636, and, as we will see, of many other dangers too, by praying to the Madonna della Salute. Down a tiny alley, you come to an underpass called Sottoportico in Venetian that marks the entrance to this corte, and that's what you see at the other end coming out, and then here's the corte. Local legend has it that during the plague of 1630, a resident of the corte, Giovanna, had a dream in which the Virgin Mary appeared to her and instructed her to paint an image of Mary together with the plague saints Rocco and Sebastian, and to place this image in the portico. And lo, though almost 50,000 Venetians died during this plague outbreak, not a single person in the Corte Nova succumbed. They placed a slab of red Verona marble, which you can see here in both these images there, and it's bad luck to step on that slab, I'm telling you now, to mark the spot where plague could go no further. And here, this is put up on the wall: flee from every thought of entering here, O pestilence, this court is blessed by Mary. And they created a local votive shrine within it. It's very narrow and it's very hard to take photos of it. So I've done my best, but also utilized some of the images from Save Venice, as the images have been recently restored. The original painting by Giovanna has been replaced over the years. So there's this rather crude little image here, but there's always a little posy of flowers there left by locals. And then on one side, we have these images, as you can see, very sweet local images. And on the other side is another little altar and two other images there as well. The entrance plaque has now also been updated to include several other woes besetting the city. Most Holy Virgin Mary of Health, who on repeated occasions kept the inhabitants of this Corte Nova from the prevailing mortality, especially in the years 1630, 36, 1849, 1855, and from the bombs of any enemy aeroplanes in 1917 and 18, receive benignly their supplications, recognizing the supplications of all those of this parish, and deign to expand your protection, the most faithfully we implore of you, upon all your devotees. It does not state whether their portico protected them from COVID-19, but I hope so, for this is a very special and intimate place. So to conclude, whilst Venetians were unwittingly complicit in bringing plague to Europe and suffered greatly over the centuries from this role, the more permanent markers of plague in the city have become sites of enormous beauty, iconic of the city itself. Thank you.
Oh, Catherine, that was the most beautiful lecture, a stunning lecture. Thank you so much. Utterly enthralling. I was stunned by the depth of your erudition and can quite understand why you're held in such esteem by historians of Venice, by Venetians, as well as the enthusiasm you generate among the students that you take with you to that extraordinary city. But above all, I was just delighted with the breadth of your references, the way in which you integrate so many disciplines into your analysis of this extraordinary history, from geography to architecture, from religion to popular culture. It was a lecture that I'm sure everybody found extraordinarily thought-provoking from the very outset, when you started referring to the ways in which people in Venice, just like people in Australia and across the world, started to go about explaining where these threats have come from, and the way in which we so easily slide into stereotypes and ancient hostilities. I guess we should be very grateful that our pandemic was brief enough that the only architectural monument we have is the Mickleham Quarantine Hub. How long that will last, who knows? But certainly, I think at the end of our lockdowns, we could have done with some of those fireworks that you showed us. But thank you. Really, it was such a privilege to listen to such a superb presentation, and everybody who's listened to it will have the same reaction, I'm sure. I'm going to hand over now to our Executive Officer of the History Council, Alicia Cerreto, who's going to take over the question and answer discussion session. Thank you, Alicia.
Thanks, Peter, and thank you, of course, to you, Catherine. And I'll invite any of our audience members to put a question into the Q&A box, which is on your bottom menu bar. And you can type in a question there, and I'll put it to Catherine on your behalf. You also have an option, I believe, to be anonymous if you wish. But while everybody is thinking of their questions, Catherine, I thought I might ask you about a contemporary reflection on your talk. And I wonder, are you seeing anything that might hint at a response of beauty to our current pandemic of COVID?
No, and this is something that kind of pains everybody, I think. You know, there was all of that rhetoric. Maybe it was a way of keeping our spirits up when we were all in those interminable lockdowns, to say this is time for a reset, it's time for a reset. And the world, I think, was enchanted and enthralled by those pictures of Venice, utterly still, with the waters, without boats churning them up. Although rumours of the dolphins in the Grand Canal were just that.
Yes.
You know, you should be very worried if there are dolphins in the Grand Canal. That global warming would be accelerating at a terrible pace. But no, I've been a bit shocked at the way in which it's sort of business as normal, but then not business as normal. You know, what has happened afterwards. So I'm yet to see the response of beauty. In fact, you know, many of the, in the city of Venice itself, a couple of hundred at the last tally of the shops and restaurants in the historic centre have been forced to close due to economic pressures. And the problem, of course, that although Venice was a problematic site for over-tourism, you then didn't want to have no tourists. And as a one-stop economy, it was quite devastating for the city. So let's hope that some moments of beauty return.
And I did wonder, when you were taking us through that sort of epic video of the Festa del Redentore, do you know what happened on that special day in 2020, 2021, and perhaps this year was more of an opportunity to celebrate it in the way that they had in the past?
Yeah, they certainly did this year. And there was a lot of debate in the city as to whether they should have these festivals, which of course are there to kind of get divine assistance in these, but also become terrible crowd opportunities. So in a very, very limited fashion, not in 2020, but in 2021 and 2022.
And it sounds like it is a tourist attraction for people to come to, as well as something for the locals. Is that right?
Oh, rightly so. If you have the chance in your lifetime, do go and get on a little boat and sit in the middle of the lagoon and just be in the middle of all of that noise as well, and light. And of course, I mean, we have our wonderful Sydney New Year's Eve and Melbourne New Year's Eve, but what you're seeing lit up is all of these extraordinary monuments of Venice. So it's sort of like seeing Venice, you know, in extraordinary explosive kind of flashes of light. It's like bolts of lightning highlighting the city. So no, it's really quite an extraordinary thing to go to.
Well, I think you'll be inspiring many more people to go and visit Venice with an added understanding of the history of that city.
I hope so.
I have a question here from Sandra, who offers a big thank you and says, is it then a safe hypothesis that most art in Italy during this period is related to or reflecting on their plague experiences?
Oh, I wouldn't go so far as to say most art, no. But to be keenly attuned when you're looking at art from this period to the iconography of the various plague saints and what that might be signifying. Of course, Saint Sebastian himself becomes incredibly popular as a Renaissance subject because it gives an artist an opportunity to show the male nude and often in all sorts of contorted positions because of arrows kind of coming in at different. So Saint Sebastian becomes a very popular subject for Renaissance art, but no, I wouldn't go so far as to say most at all. No, most, in fact, most Renaissance art is of the Virgin and Child for private devotion in the home as well as externally. But do be attuned to seeing it and look out for these plague saints and where they are and what they might be telling you about that site.
And we have, again, a question and thanking you for the marvellous lecture. Do you think the beauty in these plague responses was essentially an integral part of contemporary Venetian response to most things, or was beauty in particular useful as a plague response? And that's from Kathleen.
What a beautiful question. And of course, one can't know, but it does seem to me that the whole city in this period, everything about Venice is improbable and improbably beautiful and built in this completely inhospitable series of, you know, mud flats, basically, in a mosquito-infested lagoon, really. And yet there was this capacity to create beauty and to take your breath away with it. So I like to think it's a particularly Venetian response, and one could do test cases in other cities. But of course, because Venice is a port city, it had to be particularly vigilant against plague. And so, of course, the plague is hitting everywhere, but the Venetians are constantly battling against it. And you know, take the opportunity to have a competition for how to build a church, you know, build something quite spectacular. So I can't give a definitive answer to that, but to me, the whole city, you know, takes one's breath away as it does when everyone visits there.
And following on from that idea of, or that reflection on Venice as a maritime and commercial centre, Graham asks, do you think that the Venetians came to a more refined understanding of the causes and paths of transmission of disease over the duration of its successive appearances?
Well, actually, there, as you can see from how we have responded to COVID-19, we're still facing these very blunt instruments for dealing with contagion that spreads so quickly. Quarantine, isolation, stay in your homes, don't be in contact with each other very much. That's the main response. There's a lot of energy spent in trying to work out the causes of these various plagues, dating back to 1347, 1348. The Sorbonne, the medical practitioners in the Sorbonne are commissioned and produced the first medical treatise on plague as a result of that. But they're mixing it up with all sorts of their other understandings about the humours of the body, about the influence of the zodiac, the position of the planets. They think it's a miasma that has been released of foul-smelling air, and hence the need to balance it, counteract that with an equal and opposing sweet smell. They have all sorts of theories, but they don't come any closer to it. And so just keep using these crude but very effective, as we've seen, mechanisms of prevention. Just keep away from each other, you know, and try and stop transmission in that way. But no, they don't come to any, and we still don't know exactly what disease it was, despite the common assumption that it's Yersinia pestis, which it may be, but there are all sorts of problems with that theory.
And Julie's asking you about the lazzaretti, and she was wondering who were the people who were working there, and do we know if some survived?
No, and that's another good question. And I'm afraid I don't really know the answer to that, actually, as to who the workers were. But I would imagine that the mortality rate was pretty high. But no, I would love to be able to get back to you on that one. I don't know enough about the actual workers there. It wouldn't have been a great job.
And we've got a question from David, who says, do those early ghastly descriptions of death, decay and horror on those islands of isolation ever emerge in more recent acts of remembering amidst the beauty of architecture and ritual, the festival? Do those sort of less beautiful parts of it show up?
Not generally in the great monuments, and most people, although they'll say, oh yes, Redentoria, that's for the plague, until COVID-19, it hadn't really come into popular discourse that I was aware of. But there's increasing examination of those aspects, partly because we are now more pandemic attuned, I think. But the lazzaretti themselves, there's an association, several of my photos I acknowledge there came from that association, that are working actively, and they are wanting to make the Lazzaretto Nuovo into an archaeological museum, and so have been working very hard to create that. So I think that brings more of those sorts of descriptions to people's minds. But in the churches themselves, no. I'm not aware of them, except that at the same time, in the way that you are kind of confronted whenever you go into, if you go into the San Rocco, of course, there's, endless paintings by Tintoretto of writhing bubo-infested bodies, and people dying in all sorts of hideous ways. So you kind of accept it and walk past it without going, hang on a minute, what's actually happening on that wall? So that's there visually in front of you everywhere. But so it's a kind of mixed response. I don't know whether that answers the question adequately.
But it sounds like, there's some reality of the experience. It's not all sort of glossed over and made sort of a beautiful story only of survival. You can see
no, you can see the writhing bodies everywhere on the walls, very, very clearly depicted.
Yeah. There's a question here around linguistic change in Venice during plague from Gregory, who says, as a trade hub, I imagine Venetian language speakers would have been exposed to lots of linguistic diversity. In the isolation imposed as a result of plague, do we see certain language features change if they were fading and then they've come back?
Well, I'm not a linguistic expert, so I wouldn't be able to give a complete answer to that. But in the times of plague, what you find, particularly like on the Lazzaretto Nuovo, there's a Muslim cemetery. And, the boats are coming in and they're being isolated for a period. So you still have the great mix of people, and Venice was a huge hub of different nationalities. So I wouldn't know specifically what changes as a result there. The Venetian dialect is very distinctive, but I don't know to what extent being isolated from periods of plague, because they're, in periods of time, it's not as though it's for years on end or something like that. They're isolated. So I don't know, I'm afraid.
Yeah. Peter asks a question. Could you elaborate on the question, on the connection between quarantine, the 40 days, and Lent, Christ in the wilderness? What came first, or is that impossible to answer?
Oh no, you know, Christ in the wilderness and Lent came first. That's a, you know, an ancient, you know, tradition in the church. But in deciding on the number 40 and the period that one needs to isolate, that resonance with Lent, that people were aware of that, you know, the period of suffering, but at the end of that period of suffering, there is the great joy of Easter, the great salvific story. So it works within that, even if at times quarantine was just 15 days or maybe 30 days or 35, it still utilized that notion, that symbolic number of 40 because of the resonances with it. So yes, certainly Christ in the desert, biblical, Lent, you know, a long tradition in the Christian church.
And it's hard, you know, not to ignore the, you know, the religious element to all of the stories that you've told us here tonight in terms of the church and all of that inbuilt tradition for the city of Venice. You know, is that part of the difference to how we might see things today? Is that, I suppose, the reduction of religious elements to our more general life, perhaps part of the way that it's not embedded, that responsibility in a religious sense, as you've shown us tonight?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Although some people have tried a kind of plague reset. I don't know whether it's specifically the religious element here as well. But the idea certainly of giving, you know, thanks in an appropriate way for just extraordinary misery. You know, when a third of the inhabitants of your city have died, and you've prayed and you think that that's why you're delivered from it, then you want to give the most appropriate thanks for that and do it in the most spectacularly beautiful of fashions. I mean, so much of the art in this period is inspired by this religious impulse. So I don't know whether that applies more broadly or not. I don't know.
I was struck when you said you were talking about fear at the beginning of your talk, and you know, thinking about those emotions, but you were talking about it lasting for 4 centuries, that idea. And I wondered whether, you know, fear might help people or prompt people to cling to traditions. I wonder if there was a connection there.
Yeah, fear can do all sorts of things though, because although not in Venice that I know of, but you know, there are far nastier aspects of each of the outbreaks. You know, terrible pogroms against the Jews in 1348, 1349. Huge burnings happened in the Germanic lands of the Jewish people. They were blamed for poisoning the wells. You know, there was this terrible fear in looking for where is this thing coming from, in the same way that, you know, Saint Sebastian's arrows. What are we all doing in common? Or we're all drinking the water. Maybe someone's poisoned it. And so these same kinds of blame games, you know, went hand in hand. So it wasn't that it was merely just the response of beauty. Fear does a range of things to people, and there are all sorts of nastier aspects to this. And there are some terrible accounts in the primary source documents in the period of, you know, people abandoning relatives, people being walled up in houses, you know, out of terror of catching this unknown disease. And yes, the fact that it goes on for 4 centuries, you know, you're never free of it. There's always this fear. So there is this underlying fear. And then, of course, you know, more sophisticated mechanisms of trying to deal with disease come into play, and none is as spectacularly awful as that first 18 months of the outbreak. Yeah, so it's a double-edged thing, fear.
And you were talking about Jewish communities in Venice, and Natalie has a question here asking whether, do we know anything about Jewish responses to the plague in Venice?
So I was talking about Jewish communities more broadly. The Jewish community in Venice in the early period, although we know that there were Jews in the city, they have an ambivalent relationship in the city, and it's not until the early 16th century that they established the ghetto in Venice. Again, another word that's been you know, in the Western canon as a result of that, which, although obviously one does not want to isolate Jewish communities, but it actually became a place of refuge of sorts as Jews were being persecuted elsewhere in Europe and forced out of areas, particularly from the Spanish territories. They came to Venice because they knew, although they would be isolated in this area, they would be safe and granted certain privileges there. The Jews were, of course, the great doctors and brought a lot of Arabic knowledge as well. So again, there's this constant ambivalence in the relationship with Jewish communities. So while people would be asking Jews for their medical knowledge and for treatment, they then had to go back into the ghetto at night as the curfew struck and had the gates closed there. So I could give another lecture on the Jews of Venice, but the ghetto is an amazing area. But so yes, Jewish doctors were called upon, but there was, at least as far as I know, no pogrom against them during the initial outbreaks in the Venetian territories.
Mm-hmm. And Kathleen asks another question. She was struck by the inclusion of an Islamic cemetery that you mentioned. And how common was that for facilities like the Lazzaretti to include cemeteries for different religious traditions in this period?
That's quite remarkable, and I didn't know about that until Ambika Flavel told me about it. And there, I think it's on the Lazzaretto Nuovo in particular, and I can be corrected, but because there you've got all the traders coming in on their ships and they're being inspected, someone might die there. So neither of those cemeteries are the large ones, like on the Lazzaretto Nuovo, where the sick are sent, and there are just huge plague pits there. They couldn't deal with the quantities of dead, whereas on the Nuovo, they're not dealing with huge numbers of dead people. So when people die, they give them an appropriate site. It was known as the Cemetery of Tripoli. So obviously an emphasis on where people were coming from trade-wise there.
And I also was struck by your final example of that real local response. What was that like to come across the first time you got to visit?
It's absolutely magical, I have to say. It just sort of opens up and you sort of, it's one of those what in the weird moments when you go down that little alleyway, and it's so tiny and so hard to get a good image of what it's like to go through. But also what's beautiful is that just Venetians in that area are just charging through it on their normal everyday, you know, passing through beauty on a daily adventure, not stopping in the same way that, you know, we might go, my goodness, what on earth is going on here? It's created almost like a little theatre, you know, with those wooden curtains that they've created at the end of it. It's absolutely magical, I have to say.
And do we know, were there other examples that just didn't perhaps survive as long as this one in terms of local response?
It's the only one that I know of, but I would love to. But also, in addition, all around the city, you have tiny little altars on the walls, you know, where, you know, still today, you know, locals will put fresh flowers in front of them and things. So there are little sites like that all through the city, different altars for local devotion, but I haven't seen one where people have specifically, you know, said this, you know, Giovanna had her vision and we put it on the wall and look what happened, and the plague didn't dare go past this red brick, you know, so they're kind of quite extraordinary.
So if you know where to look, you might, if you're traveling in Venice, or you might find those, or for the rest of us, not for you, I'm sure you know where.
Yeah, no, I'd be delighted to give anyone the indications for how to get there if you want to.
Wonderful, wonderful. And I almost wonder if that's more where we can draw that contemporary connection to the way that we beautified our neighbourhoods when we were limited to our 5 kilometres if you were in Melbourne during the pandemic.
That's right.
Yeah, so where people did, they sort of wanted to signify something, signify connection, signify a little bit of light in their day, whether it was by hanging things in their trees or putting things in their windows.
The teddy bears in the windows for the little children was a lovely thing around Melbourne in particular, I thought. Yes, no, you know, people do look for these sorts of gestures too, not linked to miracles as far as I know.
No.
But anyway, we may yet have a miracle of a teddy bear in Melbourne, I don't know. But it's that other level of the layer of meaning that these people are giving to what's happening around them that I find quite fascinating.
And bringing it again to that current day, I too was struck by what it must have been like for you teaching about pandemics when you and your students were going through it. And Meredith has a question here around that, saying, are there any reflections from your students of this experience of learning and experiencing at the same time, or for you yourself?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It really was one of the most moving and extraordinary things to do, because we very rapidly had to go to teaching all online, and just seeing the faces of those students, and then increasingly looking more and more desperate as we were all in those rooms endlessly, getting to know students and their pets and their homes very well. But I also, a friend of mine in Venice, Anna Sanakina, is an opera singer, and she was becoming more and more upset at what was happening in her city and the loneliness of it and the lack of a stage to sing. And she started every evening singing from her window to the city of Venice in the most beautiful way. And so I showed Anna Sanakina's singing to the students, and we had that as part of our connection there. And in fact, she features on the Friends of History at Melbourne Facebook site too, because this beautiful song that she sang to her city, which suddenly had resonance for the students. I mean, every year students, it's a great topic to teach. People usually sit up when you start talking about plague, but you always see it as something distant. SARS was happening to other people far away, or particular groups, but never had students suddenly gone, oh my goodness, this is what it must have been like. So it was very moving, and still is very moving, to take my students on that journey.
And yes, what about for yourself? I imagine that you were able to predict some of the responses, perhaps. Certainly medically, or using quarantine and isolation. I wonder if those were easy for you to predict as a historian of this period.
Well, I didn't predict, I'm ashamed to say, but I was struck each time. I just went, oh my goodness. And then I'd pick up here's the medieval parallel, and here's, what's happening now. When you look at the plague masks of the plague doctors filled with different things, and here we all are wearing our masks. And, and actually what struck me, again, as I guess I said, was still how blunt our instruments are. Of course, we've got a vaccine, but other than that, it's still these blunt, practical methods invented by the Venetians that are still what we're using: quarantine, masks, distancing, the same things. So that's what really struck me, I think. Yeah.
And if the study of this period and your reflections on the nature of beauty could teach us anything now in our current day, what sort of message do you think you could have for us tonight?
Goodness, I don't know. I should have thought about that, shouldn't I? I think just looking at these responses of beauty, it takes my breath away, as Venice always does. Whenever I land there, I just go, wow. Every time it's like the first time almost. And just thinking, this is what one can do and could do, even when faced by absolutely appalling circumstances. So I suppose there's some hope there. I don't know. Or let's start raising money for a new building campaign or something. I don't know. Get that quarantine station renovated that Peter was referring to. I don't know. Yeah, just keep hold of beauty, I think.
Yes, that's wonderful. And do you think this work might mean that we are revising our notion of the Venetian past more broadly? Will plague times loom larger in the history writing?
Oh, it's always been a strong part of the history writing of Venice. So, but just the research on the Lazzaretti in particular is really accelerated with the archaeological excavations, and so that's the really exciting new development there. And also archival discoveries always, come forward, and about those workers on the islands too. I need to note that one down. That was a great question.
Yes, our audience has prompted you to.
Yeah, whether you're forced to do it or whether you, I don't know quite what happens there. Don't know.
Yes, who was put into those roles. Yeah. Well, I'm going to invite Peter McPhee back onto our screens. And thank you so much, Catherine, for answering all of those questions and helping sate our curiosity.
And beautiful questions. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks to our audience as well.
And I know, Catherine, that the State Library of Victoria, for example, has set itself the goal of collecting as much material, ephemera and so on, that would to document the experience of people in Victoria. And it'll be fascinating to see one day what an historian might make of the collection that they've put together. And I'm sure there are other collecting institutions around the country that have done likewise. But thanks to you and Alicia for a lovely conversation, moderated so well, and for your brilliant answers. And we've had just a very privileged experience. Thank you so much.
Oh, well, thank you for the privilege, Peter.
Before we go, I just got one last thing that I'd like to do, and one last slide that I'd like to show, and that is just to make a pitch for the importance of the History Council and its friends. We're very dependent on our friends for the funding of the work at the History Council. We have no ongoing funding, apart from the help that the Department of Education gives us for our History Roadshow for VCE students. So please, I'm hoping that people watching this beautiful lecture will join us as a friend, subscribe to our newsletter, which is a wonderful way of keeping in touch with what's going on in the world of history across the state, or follow us on one of our social media channels. But once again, everybody, on your behalf, I offer my sincere thanks to Catherine for really a virtuoso performance, and one that is, I'm sure, going to live on for so many of us in the way that we reflect on the experiences that we've been through in recent years, and how they connect with an extraordinarily different response in a distant land long ago. Thank you all, and thank you for attending. I trust that you've enjoyed a very special occasion. Thank you.